Sitting with the thinker, trying to work it out. Hi everyone, hoping that you all are well. Thank you for joining us for our discussion on the eponym of the Americas. What we're going to be doing is looking at the etymology of the name America. And what we find is that the name America is simply a resurrection of the historical name Amorite. And so when we finish this discussion, it's going to be brief. You will be left with contemplating the implications, the historical implications, the theological implications, and the psychological implications of being called the name Amorite. Now, there are many narratives about the naming of the Americas. However, when looking at the totality of the history, it leads right back to this word Amorite. Now, when you look at the word Amorite, it's a little confusing and misleading because the word Amorite is really pronounced Amori. And so when you look at it here, you see the transliteration. And this name is attributed to a group of people that, according to some narratives, these people were the ancient Canaanites. However, when you look at the history and you look at some of the scripture, you see that there is a bit of confusion about the identity of these people. And so they are considered a Semitic group of people, in addition to being identified as a Canaanite group of people. Nevertheless, this group, this entity, is understood as one who is of prominence, one who is high, one who is lofty. The individuals are usually thought of as living in the mountains. They are thought of as highlanders. This name is associated with the idea of a summit. And so it's not just a hill or a mountain, it's the highest point of a hill or a mountain. It is the top, it is the crown, it is the corona. Not only is the name Amorite or Amori associated with this idea of prominence, mountaineer, highlander, summit, it's also associated with the same construct that is attributed to the group known as Judah. And so Amorite or Amori is associated with this idea of celebrated or being praised. The word Amorite also translates as a sayer. These individuals were understood as people who lived in the land of Canaan, but they were, according to the narrative, dispossessed by the Jacob incursion from Egypt. And so, in other words, they were conquered by, according to the narrative, the descendants of Jacob, and they were dispossessed of their land by the entity known as Jacob. Another interesting notation about this name, Amorite or Emory, is that it's not just a name for a people group. It's also used as an adjective. And so it's used to describe people. And so individuals can be indicated as Amorites based upon a description versus simply being a part of a genetic line. There are also various transliterations with respect to this name. There are countless transliterations with respect to this name. And you see the name in terms of transliterations: Egypt, Amara, you see Tel Armana, you also see Amaru. Amorite is an important people group in Scripture, and the name actually appears over 80 times in Scripture. In one situation, they are indicated as living west of Jordan. In another situation, they are indicated as living in the south. They are also generally understood as ancient inhabitants of Canaan. They are listed among the Canaanitish people. However, they are also understood as Semitic people. They are also, as we've already indicated, a people group dispossessed by the descendants of Jacob. This entry indicates an Amorite, a nation of Canaan, and apparently the greatest and most powerful of them all, and whose name is sometimes used in a wider sense so as to include all the nations of Canaan. The discussion goes on to indicate a part of them dwelt in the mountainous region, which was afterwards occupied by the tribe of Judah, where they were subject to 5 kings. It's important to note at this point that according to history, the Amorites disappeared from history. According to scripture, there's the understanding that the descendants of Jacob destroyed the Amorites. So, either way you look at it, the Amorites are no longer supposed to be a part of history. However, when you look at the naming dynamics around the world and the history of the names of these people groups around the world, you see that the Amorite has been resurrected in terms of name across the entire globe. And so you see various people groups with this particular name, with variations of this particular name. And it appears that the Americas are sort of the top of the top in terms of this name. And so the epitome of Amorite, in other words. And so this is important to keep in mind because, again, there is this assertion that the Amorites no longer exist. But based upon this naming dynamic, it appears that the Amorites continue to exist, and it hasn't been a secret that they've existed, and that they've gone around conquering various people groups around the world and then giving them their names. And so the identities of the people have been taken and they have been replaced with these Amorite names or these Amorite derivatives. And you see these Amorite derivatives in places such as Armorica, that was over in Europe. And then there was a place, Marmarica, that was up in North Africa. You see Amorite in Morocco and Marrakesh. Some individuals will indicate that America is named after Morocco. However, it appears that all of these groups are actually named after the ancient Amorites. And this is important because the ancient Amorites were also the entities ruling Babylon. And so we're just going to look at a few nation state names that are essentially the namesakes of the Amorites or the Amori. And you can see here, first up, United Arab Emirates. And so Emirates is just another way of saying Amorites. You also have America, and America is another way of saying Amorite. And here are a few more, of course, including Morocco. You also have on here Marshall Islands and Mauritania, which is, of course, associated with Morocco. And so all of these are variations of this Amorite or Emery or Amori. As we begin to wrap this up, we're just going to look at one additional dynamic with respect to this identity of the Amorites or the Amori or the Amori. And it's this king whose name was Amraphel. And Amraphel has a name that is shared with Amorite in terms of the meaning. And so it's associated with this idea of a sayer. Some individuals might think of soothsayer. This is associated with this idea of sayer. This individual was understood as the king of Babylon. And in some instances, individuals associate this entity with Hammurabi. In some instances, this entity is associated with Nimrod or Nimrud. This name also translates as sayer of darkness, or fall of the sayer. And so this is associated with that idea of a fallen one. Another noteworthy dynamic about the relationship between those identified as Amorite and those identified as the descendants of Jacob is that in current times you have these entities actually sharing the same land space, and in many instances sharing the same identity. And so in some instances, these identities have been conflated, and so it's very difficult to disentangle who might actually be Jacob and who might actually be Amorite. And you also have that interesting notation in scripture where Abraham is referred to as being descended from an Amorite. And so, in many ways, this situation is very similar to our discussion related to Barbados. When there are conquest situations, the conquerors typically change the names of the people. And so this is no exception. And so you had the Moriscos and the Marranos come in, and ultimately this entire land space was named Amorite, essentially, which goes along with Morisco and Marrano. And so, in many ways, they were simply giving the name that they had for themselves to the people that were being conquered, that were being displaced, that were being enslaved. And so now you have a people group that have embraced this identity of Amorite in the form of America or American and everything that goes with it. And so, again, just like Barbados, it's not what they call you, it's what you answer to. And this particular name, even though it has not been widely addressed, has quite a bit of heavy baggage to it. And so when embracing the name Amorite in any form, one is embracing the idea of being a Babylonian. And so one is actually referring to self as a Babylonian whenever they identify as an Amorite, when they are identifying as Moroccan, when they are identifying as American, when they are identifying as Mauritanian. And in some ways, when you look at the various transliterations, even when identifying as such, like Turkey with that UR. And so there are many instances where people groups are identifying Maori, identifying as Amorites, identifying as Babylonians, not because they are actually ancient Babylonians, but because they have been conquered by these people groups who have then superimposed these names. And so I'm going to leave it to you to entertain the historical, the theological, and the psychological implications of referring to self as an ancient Babylonian, referring to oneself as an ancient Amorite, particularly if that's not one's actual ancestral identity.